I proposed to my boyfriend, and he said no, then told me he's in love with my best friend. The hallway outside his apartment felt colder than it should have been for late evening. The overhead lights hummed, not loudly, just enough to make the silence more noticeable. I had one hand inside my coat pocket, pressed around the small ring box I'd been carrying all week. My thumb kept tracing the edge of it, checking the corners the same way I'd checked every detail of the plan. I knew some people would have opinions about a woman proposing. I'd already heard the subtle comments from co-workers, jokes about letting the man lead, but none of that mattered. Not when he and I had been together since we were kids. Practically. Not when I had loved him longer and harder than I'd ever loved anything. I didn't care about tradition. I cared about him. And I wanted him to know it plainly, without waiting for whatever moment he might or might not plan. The elevator behind me clicked shut. I stood there listening for movement on the other side of his door. Instead, I heard music. Something low and steady he only played when he was alone. And under it, faintly, a woman's laugh. At first, I froze, not because I suspected anything outrageous, but because I recognized the laugh. You can know someone for years and still never forget the sound they make when they're amused with themselves. Hers was a small laugh, almost polite in its tone. Always a little too light. She was decent, I always said. Harmless. Pleasant enough. Not someone I ever saw as competition. I was the one with the degree, the stable career, the plan. She drifted. She tried things. She changed jobs like hobbies. I never felt threatened by her. I didn't need to. But hearing her laugh from inside his place made the air shift around me. My hand hovered above the door, not knocking yet, just feeling the faint warmth coming through it. The doormat was crooked, tilted like someone had stepped on it in a hurry. The smell of someone's dinner drifted from a unit farther down, something with garlic and butter. Too warm for the draft in the hallway. The laugh came again, quieter this time, followed by his voice. His tone was loose, unguarded, a tone he didn't usually use with me unless we were already settled in for the night. I tightened my fingers around the ring box, not out of fear, more like bracing myself against confusion. I'd rearranged my whole schedule for this evening. I'd taken extra time off. I had been ready to show him, finally, that I wasn't waiting on some outdated idea of who should kneel and who should accept. I was showing him that I loved him enough to ask for a forever with him first. It wasn't desperation. It was commitment. Something I had more of than most people my age. Especially her. I knocked. Softly, but enough to cut through the music. The voices stopped immediately. Not gradually. Just stopped. A single shuffle of footsteps followed, like someone adjusting themselves before answering. That was the part I remember most clearly. That, and the small strand of blonde hair caught on his welcome sign, moving slightly in the draft from the vent overhead. It looked out of place, like it had been torn off in a rush. When he opened the door, his expression wasn't surprised. Not happy, either. Just flat around the edges. Polite. The kind of expression people use in public, not with someone they've been with for nearly a decade. He stepped aside to let me in. No kiss. No touch. Not even a hand on my back the way he usually did without thinking. Inside, the apartment was warm, dimmer than normal because the overhead bulb above the kitchen island had burned out again. I'd offered to replace it weeks ago, but he kept saying he'd get to it. He never did. I heard movement behind the partition wall. Then she stepped out, holding a water bottle like she wasn't sure if she should put it down or keep holding it. She said my name, soft, practically swallowed. I studied her expression. She looked almost guilty, but not enough to be truly worried. More like she'd been caught in something inconvenient. Her hair was slightly mussed, not in a dramatic way, just lived in. She wasn't supposed to be here. Not on this night. Not when I'd said I had plans with him. Not when he'd agreed. Still, I didn't react. I sat on the edge of the couch, legs crossed neatly, hands resting together on my knee like I was the one hosting them. I'd always been composed like that. Even in high school, people used to say I carried myself like someone older, someone who already knew where she was going. She never had that. She drifted beside me like a satellite, close but never steady. He brought me a mug of tea and set it in front of me without meeting my eyes. The steam rose between us, fogging a small part of my vision. She lingered by the counter, pretending to scroll through her phone. The conversation was shallow. Work, schedules, a show we'd been watching, everything spoken carefully, as though anything too specific might cause a hairline crack somewhere in the room. I didn't take the ring box out. I didn't even touch it. Proposing with her standing there would have been ridiculous. And I wasn't ridiculous. People might question a woman proposing, but I was prepared for their opinions, not this. She left soon after, said she had an early morning. She didn't look in a hurry. When she passed him, her hand brushed his arm lightly. Familiar. Too familiar. He didn't pull away. The door clicked shut behind her, and the apartment felt smaller. The refrigerator hummed. The heating vents clicked softly. His breathing sounded uneven for someone who supposedly had nothing to hide. He leaned against the counter and looked at the floor like he was waiting for instructions. I watched him, quiet, patient, the way I'd always been. When he finally said my name, I knew something was coming. Something bigger than an explanation about a friend staying late. But I wasn't prepared for the words that followed. Not their shape, not their simplicity, not the way he said them like he'd practiced. He didn't look up when he spoke. His eyes stayed fixed on a spot on the floor near the edge of the rug, as if the pattern there required his full attention. He started with the thing I least expected him to say, that he wasn't ready. Not for marriage, not for anything that permanent. He said it slowly, as though he was measuring the weight of each word. I sat there, hands folded over my knee. I didn't interrupt. I didn't flinch. I'd spent nearly 10 years with him since we were 17. We learned how to drive together, graduated together, moved into the city together. I'd shaped parts of my life around him in ways I didn't even bother hiding. I wasn't embarrassed by that kind of love. I'd always believed that when you choose someone, you choose them fully. When he finally lifted his gaze, I could tell he expected a break in my composure. People often assume that long-term devotion is fragile, that it collapses under disappointment. But I'd learned early on how to hold myself still. I just waited. He said no. Plain, without the cushioning people use when they're trying not to hurt someone. Then he followed it with something that hung in the air like steam from the tea in front of me. He said he was in love with someone else. At first, I didn't process it. Not really. The sentence felt too simple, too neat, like a placeholder for a more complicated truth. He rubbed the back of his neck, the way he did when he didn't want to be touched. The silence stretched out between us, thick but steady. Then he said her name. That part I do remember clearly, the way the sound of it seemed out of place in his mouth. Too casual, too familiar. I kept my face neutral, but inside everything tightened into a straight line. Her, of all people. The one I never considered a threat because she'd always seemed like someone who lived in the shallow end of life. Nice enough, pleasant, but without the depth I knew he valued. Without the stability. Without the ambition. I had built a life that made sense, a career with milestones, a home that could withstand real plans. She couldn't hold a job for more than a year. I used to help her rework her resume, clean up the way she wrote emails. I taught her half the things she now used to impress people. And hearing that he'd chosen her, felt something for her, didn't make emotional sense, not in any practical reality. He kept talking, but most of it slipped past me like static. He said it had happened slowly. He said they hadn't meant for anything to cross a line. He said it wasn't physical. I listened without moving, letting each phrase settle in my mind, cataloging them carefully, like items placed in labeled folders. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't ask how long. People who lose control often look foolish in retrospect. I wasn't going to be one of those people. Instead, I set the mug down gently, still full, untouched. The ceramic clicked against the wood table, small but sharp. I asked him when he realized it. He hesitated, then said, sometime in the early fall. 3 months. 3 months of silence on his end. 3 months of me planning a proposal, rearranging schedules, making sure I was choosing a ring style he'd actually wear. 3 months of him nodding along to conversations about our future, with an expression I now recognized as careful. After that conversation, I left his apartment without anything dramatic. No slammed door, no tears. I walked down the hallway at a steady pace, feeling the ring box still pressed against my hip. When I reached the elevator, I stood there long enough for my breath to even out. He didn't follow me. The next morning, routine pulled me forward. I got dressed for work the way I always did. Hair tied neatly, coat zipped, ID badge clipped to my sleeve. On the train, the lights flickered the same way they always did around the third stop. Everything moved as if nothing had shifted. But I felt a kind of clarity that surprised me. Not the sharp emotional kind. More like the procedural clarity I use at work when something doesn't add up. I needed information. I needed to understand the sequence of events. That was all. Emotion could come later, in an organized place. At lunch, I sat with my phone and went through old messages. That's when I noticed the first pattern. Her name appearing more often than it used to. Small things at first, memes, copied links, a shared joke I wasn't part of, then longer threads, her telling him she had a bad day, him responding faster than he usually responded to me, not incriminating on its own, but cumulative. By the third screenshot, I stopped pretending it was coincidence. I started documenting. Date, time, content, tone. Not to punish anyone, just to understand the scope. When you've spent most of your life with someone, it's easy to assume you know every contour of how you fit together. I needed to see where that contour had changed. 2 days later, I called her. I didn't say anything confrontational. I just asked if she wanted to get coffee, the way we used to. She agreed easily, which told me she wasn't afraid yet, or wasn't aware enough to be. We met at a small cafe near her apartment. She looked the same as always. Slightly rushed, sweater slightly wrinkled, a style that tried but never quite landed. She smiled like everything was normal. I asked about her job. She said she'd left it again. Something about management not respecting her creativity. I nodded, listening, the way I always had. Then I asked casually how often she'd been seeing him. Her jaw shifted slightly, just enough that someone less observant might miss it. She said not often, just as friends. She said they talked, sure, but it wasn't anything serious. I stirred my tea slowly, watching the surface ripple. I didn't call her a liar. I didn't need to. She kept explaining without being asked. Her voice moved faster. That was all the confirmation I needed. When we stood to leave, she hugged me. A light embrace. The kind people give when they want permission to keep liking themselves. By the end of that week, I had enough information to see the full outline. The texts, the calls, a photo she'd posted weeks earlier that I'd barely noticed. Him in the background. His hand on her chair. Familiarity captured accidentally. Little things, but real. That weekend, I went to his apartment to talk again. I didn't bring the ring. I didn't bring anything. Just a list of what I knew and what I needed him to clarify. He looked tired when he opened the door, like admitting it had exhausted him. He didn't invite me to sit. We spoke quietly. He apologized. He explained. He said he never meant for it to happen. He said he didn't want to hurt me. I didn't respond to that. People who don't want to hurt you usually stop themselves before the point of no return. He hadn't. That was the truth. Simple. Factual. I left after 20 minutes. On the walk home, the air felt colder than the hallway had. Not painful, just clean. What came next wasn't emotional. It was logistical. I made a folder on my computer. I copied every screenshot into it. I wrote a timeline. I wrote a list of questions. Not for him, but for myself. Questions about what patterns I had overlooked. Not because I blamed myself, but because understanding the shape of something helps remove its power. And in the quiet of my apartment, with the documents open in front of me, I realized something I hadn't expected. I had done everything right. I had been steady, loyal, devoted. I had been the one planning a future. She had been drifting. He had been wavering. None of their choices changed the fact that I had been the better partner. I knew that with a clarity that settled deep in my chest. And once I saw that, truly saw it, I understood what needed to happen next. The following week, I asked him to meet me somewhere neutral. Not at his apartment, not at mine. We chose a small conference room at the community center near the train station. Glass walls, quiet fluorescent lighting. A place that didn't hold any sentimental weight. A place that made conversations feel procedural. He arrived a few minutes late. He looked like he hadn't slept well. His shoulders were slightly hunched, his hair uncombed in a way that wasn't intentional. He sat across from me without making eye contact. The room felt cold, but clean. The hum of the ceiling vent was steady and predictable. It helped me focus. I didn't waste time. I opened the folder I'd brought, a physical folder this time, cream-colored with printed screenshots clipped neatly inside. I laid the first page on the table. He looked at it, then at me, and then back at the page. His throat tightened visibly. "I'm not here to argue," I said. My voice was level. "I just want clarity." He nodded. I walked him through the timeline. Messages, calls, date stamps. I didn't accuse. I presented facts. That's the thing about truth. When it's organized, it leaves little room for denial. He didn't try to contradict anything. He just sat there, occasionally running his thumb along the inside of his palm the way he did when he felt cornered. My voice stayed steady as I spoke, almost detached. Not because I didn't feel anything, but because I didn't want emotion to blur the accuracy of the moment. I'd spent years supporting him. During college exams, his first job loss, the months when he doubted himself. I had held him together in ways he never fully understood, and he had let another person into the space I built for the two of us. A person who had never matched me in certainty or effort. He apologized again, quietly, sincerely in his way. But apologies don't reverse patterns. They only confirm recognition. I asked him the one question that still mattered. Was it worth losing us? He stared down at the table. For a moment, he didn't seem to know how to breathe. Then he nodded. Small, almost invisible. Not a yes, not a no. Just a nod that told me everything. He had chosen uncertainty over stability, potential over reality, her over me. People talk about heartbreak like a shattering. But sitting there, hearing that nearly 10 years of shared history had been outweighed by something as flimsy as a new affection, it didn't feel like breaking. It felt like watching a bridge slowly being dismantled from the other side of the river. The structure still stood, but the connection was gone. When the meeting ended, I gathered the papers calmly. I returned them to the folder, closed it, and slid it into my bag. He didn't reach for me. He didn't try to hug me. He just watched me as if he was seeing something he hadn't expected. Someone who wasn't pleading, who wasn't collapsing, who wasn't giving him the emotional scene he had probably feared. I left first. My footsteps echoed through the empty hallway, soft but even. Over the next few days, I made changes quietly. I blocked his number, but I kept the messages archived in case I needed documentation later. I removed him from my social media, not dramatically, just systematically. I updated my emergency contact at work. I went to the leasing office to confirm that when our joint rental agreement expired, I'd be handling the paperwork alone. The clerk asked if I needed additional forms. I told her yes, and she handed me a packet of documents stapled on the corner. Procedural things, simple things. Each one created a little more distance. I didn't speak to her during that time. There was nothing productive left to say. She had made her choice, and he had affirmed it. She wasn't malicious, just ordinary. And ordinary people often slip through the cracks of other people's relationships without realizing the weight of their influence. She'd always floated. Now she'd floated into him. It made sense in its own small way. But I didn't feel threatened anymore, or inferior. If anything, the situation clarified something important. I had always been the one with direction, the one with the plan, the one who could build a future and carry weight. Not her, not him really, just me. 2 weeks after the meeting, I found the ring box in my coat pocket again. I'd forgotten it was there. The fabric around it had molded slightly to its shape. I sat on my couch and opened it. The light caught the band just the way it had in the jewelry store. It was simple, strong, understated, exactly what he would have liked. I closed it gently and placed it in a drawer. Not out of sadness, just order. That same afternoon, I called my building's locksmith. He arrived within an hour, carrying his metal case of tools. He replaced the lock on my door while I stood nearby holding the new set of keys. The fresh metal felt cool and smooth against my palm. When he handed the keys to me, he said I'd feel safer with the upgraded model. I didn't correct him. Safety wasn't the point. Control was. After he left, I stood in the doorway, listening to the quiet of my apartment. The refrigerator hummed softly. Outside, someone in the hallway rolled a suitcase past my door. The floorboards creaked the way they always did near the entryway. Everything was ordinary again. I locked the new deadbolt. The click was small, precise. In the evenings, I filled the silence with my routine, straightening the bookshelf, reorganizing the cabinet under the sink, shredding old documents I no longer needed. Small tasks that grounded me. I slept better than I expected. Not deeply, but steadily. People assume that long relationships leave holes when they end, but what I felt wasn't emptiness. It was space. Room to place things exactly where I wanted them. One night, about a month later, I passed by the park near our old high school. I stopped at the fence and leaned my hands on the cool metal rail. The air smelled faintly of cut grass. I could hear a distant whistle from the practice field. Years ago, we would walk home from here together, fingers intertwined, talking about a shared future that we both believed in back then. It wasn't painful to remember, just factual, a closed chapter. Standing there, I realized something simple and unexpectedly steady inside myself. Love hadn't been the mistake. Trust hadn't been the mistake. The only mistake had been assuming that consistency in a person guaranteed consistency in their choices. I let the thought settle. It didn't sting. It didn't burn. It just existed. After a moment, I turned away from the fence and started walking. My footsteps were even, measured. The night air felt calm around me. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual. The apartment was still, bathed in pale morning light that filtered through the curtains. I made coffee in the small French press I'd bought for myself a week earlier. Something I'd always wanted but never purchased because he preferred drip coffee. The scent filled the kitchen, rich and slightly bitter. I carried the mug to the window and stood there watching the street below. People moved with purpose. Walking dogs, carrying briefcases, pushing strollers. Life continued in its ordinary rhythm, and I was part of it again. Not as half of something, but as a whole thing on my own. That afternoon, I returned to the jewelry store where I'd bought the ring. The clerk recognized me immediately. Her face shifted into a practiced expression of sympathy when I explained I needed to return it. She didn't ask questions. She processed the return efficiently, her fingers moving quickly across the keyboard. When she handed me the receipt, she said something about store credit being available for a year. I nodded, folded the paper, and slipped it into my wallet. I didn't plan to use it, but I appreciated the gesture. Walking out of the store felt lighter than walking in had been. The ring box was gone. The physical weight of it, the symbolic weight, both released. I spent the following weeks rebuilding routines that were entirely mine. I joined a pottery class on Thursday evenings, something I'd mentioned wanting to try years ago but never pursued because our schedules didn't align. The studio was warm and smelled like wet clay and kiln heat. My hands learned to shape things from nothing, to start over when a piece collapsed, to accept imperfection as part of the process. I updated my apartment slowly. New curtains in the bedroom, lighter fabric that let in more morning sun. A bookshelf I assembled myself, following the instructions methodically, checking each screw twice. I bought plants and researched how to keep them alive. I watered them on Sundays, checking the soil with my fingertips, the way the care instructions suggested. Small acts of ownership, small confirmations of autonomy. One evening, while organizing my desk, I came across the cream folder I'd brought to our final meeting. I opened it and looked through the printed pages. Screenshots, timestamps, notes written in my careful handwriting. The evidence felt distant now, like documentation of someone else's life. I carried the folder to the kitchen and placed it in a cardboard box I kept for recycling. Then I stopped. Instead of recycling it, I sealed the box with packing tape and labeled it with the month and year. I placed it on the top shelf of my closet, behind winter coats I wouldn't need for months. Not to revisit, not to dwell on, just to acknowledge that it had happened, that I had documented it, and that I had moved through it with clarity intact. Closing the closet door felt like closing a file. Complete, organized, resolved. The weeks turned into months. I stopped checking his social media, not because I forced myself to stop, but because I genuinely forgot to look. The curiosity faded. Whatever he was doing, whoever he was with, it existed in a separate reality that no longer intersected with mine. I heard through a mutual acquaintance that he and she were still together. The information arrived casually, mentioned in passing during a conversation about something else entirely. I acknowledged it with a brief nod and continued the conversation without pause. It didn't sting. It didn't validate anything. It just was. People sometimes asked if I was dating again. I said not yet, but maybe eventually. The truth was, I felt no urgency. I had spent so long as part of a unit that being singular felt like a relief I hadn't known I needed. I was learning myself in ways I'd never had space for before. My preferences without compromise, my schedule without negotiation, my future without the weight of someone else's uncertainty. One Saturday morning, I woke to sunlight streaming through the new curtains. I made breakfast slowly, scrambled eggs, toast with butter, fresh coffee. I ate at the small table by the window, watching the world outside move through its weekend rhythm. After breakfast, I opened my laptop and looked at the folder labeled October Timeline. I hesitated for a moment, then moved it to a subfolder I titled Archive. I didn't delete it. It was still part of my history, but it didn't need to live on my desktop anymore. That afternoon, I went for a walk through the neighborhood. The air was crisp, early autumn turning the edges of leaves golden. I passed the community center where we'd had our final meeting. The building looked smaller than I remembered, just a beige structure with glass doors and a bulletin board covered in flyers. I kept walking. Eventually, I found myself at a small bookstore I'd never noticed before, the kind with narrow aisles and stacks that reached the ceiling. I spent an hour browsing, running my fingers along spines, reading back covers. I bought 3 books, 2 novels, and a memoir. The clerk wrapped them in brown paper and tied the bundle with string. Walking home with the books under my arm, I felt something I recognized as contentment. Not happiness exactly, not yet, but a steady, quiet sense of being exactly where I needed to be. That evening, I sat on my couch with one of the new books. The apartment was silent except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the building settling. I read for 2 hours without interruption, without checking my phone, without thinking about anything except the words on the page. When I finally closed the book, I looked around my apartment. The new lock on the door, the organized shelves, the plants on the windowsill, the space that was entirely mine. Everything in its place. Everything intentional. I stood and walked to the door. I turned the new deadbolt, hearing that precise click I'd heard dozens of times now. It still sounded clean. Final. I pressed my palm against the door for a moment, feeling the cool surface, the solid barrier between my space and the world outside. Then I turned away and walked back into my apartment, my footsteps steady and sure, moving forward into a life that finally belonged only to me. Sometimes healing isn't dramatic. Sometimes it's just the sound of your own footsteps, steady again, moving in a direction that finally belongs to you.